The soft hum of the oxygen machine filled the quiet room, a constant reminder of the battle Michael Reed was fighting. The 67-year-old Vietnam veteran sat back in his well-worn armchair, the fabric frayed from years of use. His tired hands, rough with age and experience, rested on his lap, one of them gripping the small remote that adjusted his chair, a simple comfort in his slowing world. Life had changed in ways he never imagined. The weight of late-stage lung cancer pressed down on him, draining his strength day by day. But today felt different. There was something in the air he couldn't quite name. Then the sudden ring of the phone broke the silence. Unexpected, yet oddly reassuring. From the kitchen, Sarah, his wife of many years, peeked over. Her short hair, streaked with gray, framed a face lined with quiet strength. "Do you want me to get that, Joe?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. He shook his head, lifting a hand to wave her off. "I got it," he rasped, his voice holding on to the strength it still had. His fingers, trembling slightly, reached for the cordless phone on the side table. Caller ID never mattered much to Michael. He believed every call was worth answering. "Hello." His voice carried a mix of curiosity and exhaustion. The voice on the other end stopped him cold. It was deep, steady, and instantly recognizable. "Is this Michael Reed?" Michael sat up, his heart suddenly beating faster. He knew that voice. He had heard it countless times on TV, in speeches, and over the years. "This is Donald Trump." Michael's breath caught in his throat. "I heard about your story, and I wanted to take a moment to call you personally." Michael blinked, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him. He turned towards Sarah, who had frozen in place, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Is this really him?" he whispered, covering the receiver with his hand. "Joe, who is it?" Sarah mouthed, stepping closer. But Michael couldn't respond to her. His heart was pounding now, pushing blood through veins that had once survived the jungles of Vietnam, but now barely had the strength to support his weakened body. He leaned back into the chair, gripping the phone tightly as his mind raced. What could Trump possibly want with someone like him? A retired mechanic, a war veteran, living out his final days in a small home in Topeka, Kansas. Yet the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Familiar not just from television, but from countless speeches Michael had admired over the years. "Well, Mr. President," Michael finally said, finding his voice, "I'm not sure what to say. This is unexpected." Trump chuckled lightly. "Sometimes the best moments in life are the ones we don't expect. I've been told you've always supported me, and I wanted to thank you for that. I don't take it for granted." The words hung in the air, leaving Michael speechless. He glanced at Sarah, whose eyes glistened with tears she hadn't realized she was holding back. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt something stir inside him, something that felt a lot like hope. "But why me?" Michael wanted to ask. Yet he held back, knowing the answer was just beginning to unfold. The veteran's grip on the phone tightened as he tried to collect his thoughts. "Thank you, Mr. President," Michael managed, his voice cracking slightly. "I've always believed in what you stand for. It's just an honor to hear from you." "Michael," Trump said, his tone more serious now, "I've read about your service. Vietnam, right?" "Yes, sir," Michael replied, sitting up straighter. Despite the years that had passed, the memories of his time in the war were never far from his mind. He could almost hear the sound of choppers slicing through humid skies and smell the acrid scent of burning foliage. It wasn't something he liked to dwell on, but it was a part of who he was, a part that had shaped him into the man he became. "You sacrificed so much for this country," Trump continued. "I've always said that our veterans are the backbone of this nation, and you're living proof of that." Michael felt a lump rising in his throat. He wasn't used to hearing words like this, especially not from someone of Trump's stature. For years, he'd battled not just the physical scars of war, but the emotional toll it had taken. He'd watched friends come home only to lose their battles to addiction, homelessness, or the demons in their minds. And now here he was, at the end of his own fight, hearing gratitude from the very leader he'd admired from afar. "Tell me about your life after the service," Trump prompted. "I want to know about the man behind the uniform." Michael hesitated. He wasn't one to talk about himself, but something about Trump's voice made him feel like he could. "Well, after the war, I came back to Kansas, married my high school sweetheart, Sarah. We've been together ever since, 45 years now. He glanced at Sarah, who stood silently in the doorway, her hand over her heart. I worked as a mechanic for most of my life, opened my own shop eventually. It wasn't much, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table. And your kids? Trump asked, his tone softening. Michael's smile faded slightly. We had one boy, Matthew. Lost him in Iraq, 2005. The words were heavy, but Michael had grown used to saying them. It didn't make the loss any easier, but it was part of his story, one he carried with him every day. There was a pause on the line, just long enough for Michael to wonder if he'd said too much. But then Trump spoke, his voice steady. Michael, I can't imagine the pain of losing a child. You've given more to this country than most people can comprehend. And yet, here you are, still standing. Michael felt a tear slip down his cheek. Some days it feels like I'm not, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But you are, Trump countered firmly. You're a survivor, Michael, and the world needs to hear stories like yours. The veteran closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. For years, he'd carried the weight of his past, thinking no one truly understood. But in this moment, it felt like someone finally did. The conversation was just getting started, but the weight of the past had set the stage for something far greater. Michael cleared his throat, trying to steady his emotions. You know, Mr. President, he began, his voice still trembling. A lot of people don't understand what it means to sacrifice for this country. It's not just the time or the pain. It's knowing you may never come back the same, or at all. Trump let the silence linger for a moment, a rare pause in his usually rapid delivery. When he spoke again, his tone was quieter, more introspective. Michael, I think about that more than people realize, about what people like you and your son have given up so that people like me could even have the chance to lead this country. It's humbling. The words surprised Michael. He hadn't expected Trump to sound so human. For all his public bravado, this side of him was disarming. Trump continued, you know, my father always taught me that success isn't about money or power. It's about legacy, what we leave behind for others. And hearing your story, it reminds me why I've fought so hard, not just for policies, but for people like you. Michael nodded instinctively, though Trump couldn't see it. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. You've got your share of critics, Michael said cautiously, but I always believed you cared about this country. That's why I supported you. I know, Michael, Trump said, and I've seen my share of fights too. Not on the battlefield like you, but battles that test your spirit just the same. Michael frowned slightly. What kind of battle, sir? Trump hesitated, and for a brief moment, the line was silent except for the faint sound of breathing. I don't talk about this often, he began, but I've faced struggles in my own way. Losing my brother Fred was one of the hardest things I've ever dealt with. He was a good man, but he fought his own demons, and eventually they got the best of him. Michael felt a pang of empathy. He didn't know much about Trump's personal life, but hearing this made the man on the other end of the line feel more real. I'm sorry to hear that, Michael said softly. Thank you, Trump replied. Fred taught me a lot about life, about resilience, about not giving up. Even when things feel impossible, I think that's why your story resonates with me so much. You've lived through so much, and yet you're still here, still fighting. Michael chuckled weakly. I don't know about fighting, Mr. President. Some days it feels more like just holding on. But isn't that the fight? Trump countered. Holding on when everything around you says to let go? The words struck a chord deep within Michael. He hadn't thought of it that way before. For years, he'd seen his life as a series of losses. Friends, his son, his health. But maybe, just maybe, the fact that he was still here meant something. As Michael pondered the president's words, he realized this wasn't just a phone call. It was a lifeline, and the conversation was far from over. Michael's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the phone against his ear. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. For so long, he'd felt invisible, a man whose contributions and sacrifices had been buried beneath the weight of time. And yet, here he was, talking to the former president of the United States who seemed to genuinely care about his story. I'll be honest with you, Michael, Trump said, breaking the silence. People see me as this larger-than-life figure, But they don't see the quiet moments. They don't see the nights when you sit alone and wonder if you're really making a difference. The vulnerability in Trump's voice caught Michael off guard. He hadn't expected this kind of candor. I imagine it's not easy, sir, Michael said, being in the spotlight like that. It's not, Trump admitted. But then I think about people like you, people who gave everything and didn't ask for anything in return. You remind me why I wanted to do this in the first place. It's not about politics, it's about people. Michael felt a lump rising in his throat again. I appreciate that, Mr. President, I really do. But honestly, I'm just an old man trying to make peace with the time I've got left. Trump's voice softened. You're more than that, Michael. You're a reminder of what this country is about. Resilience, sacrifice, hope. And I think people need to hear your story. The veteran leaned back in his chair, his gaze falling on the medals and photos that adorned the wall across from him. His Bronze Star, a black and white photo of him and his platoon, all grinning despite the mud and exhaustion etched into their faces. And then next to those, a folded American flag, a painful reminder of the son he'd buried far too soon. I don't know, sir, Michael said after a moment. It's hard to feel hopeful these days. My body's failing me, and I don't have much left to give. You've already given more than most, Michael, Trump said. But maybe what you have left isn't about giving. It's about sharing. Sharing your story, your wisdom, your strength. That's the legacy I was talking about. Michael felt the tears welling up again. He wasn't a man prone to crying, but something about this conversation was breaking down walls he hadn't even realized he'd built. You think people would care about my story? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't just think it, Michael. I know it, Trump said firmly, because your story isn't just yours. It's the story of every soldier who's fought for this country, every parent who's lost a child, every person who's struggled and still found a way to carry on. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Michael closed his eyes, letting them sink in. For so long, he'd felt like his life was winding down to nothing. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. And as that spark began to grow, so did his determination to make the most of whatever time he had left. The conversation wasn't over yet, but Michael knew it was leading somewhere important. Michael exhaled slowly, his chest tightening, not from illness this time, but from the unexpected weight of emotion. He glanced at Sarah, who was now sitting on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped together, listening intently. She'd always been his rock, but even she seemed moved by this moment, her eyes shimmering with tears. Mr. President, Michael began, his voice unsteady, you've done more for me in this one call than most people have in years. But there's something I want to say. Something I've been holding in. Trump remained quiet, giving him the space to speak. When I lost my son, Michael continued, his voice trembling, I didn't just lose him. I lost a part of myself. I kept asking, why him? Why not me? And over the years, that question has eaten away at me. Some days it's all I can think about. The room felt heavy with silence, the kind that only comes when deep truths are laid bare. Sarah reached out, placing a hand on Michael's knee, offering silent support. You're not alone in that, Michael, Trump said after a moment. I've met so many parents like you, strong, courageous, but carrying a pain that most of us can't even begin to understand. But let me tell you something my brother taught me. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones we fight for others. They're the ones we fight within ourselves. Michael wiped at his eyes, his breathing uneven. I don't know how to win that fight, he admitted. You already have, Michael, Trump said firmly. Every day you wake up and keep going, you're winning. Every time you share your story, you're helping someone else fight their battle. That's why your life matters. That's why your legacy matters. The words hit Michael like a bolt of lightning. He'd spent so many years thinking of himself as a man in decline, a man whose best days were behind him. But now, for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Pride. Maybe you're right, Michael said quietly. Maybe there's still something I can do, something I can give. There's no maybe about it, Trump replied. The world needs more men like you, Michael. Men who remind us of what it means to be brave, to sacrifice, and to keep going even when it feels impossible. Michael let the words sink in, his mind racing with possibilities he hadn't considered in years. Could he really share his story? Could he use his pain to help others? It was a daunting thought, but also an empowering one. As the conversation moved toward its conclusion, Michael felt a spark of hope. A hope that, even in his final chapter, his story could still be written. The call ended, but its impact lingered in the small living room. Michael placed the phone down on the side table, his hands still shaking. Sarah, unable to hold back any longer, leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him, her cheek resting against his shoulder. "You needed that, Joe," she whispered. "I don't know how, but you did." Michael nodded silently, his mind replaying Trump's words. He felt as though a weight had been lifted, as though he'd been given permission to feel something other than grief. Sarah pulled back, her eyes full of determination. "People need to know about this," she said. "You've always said the world forgets about people like you. Veterans, parents who've lost their kids. Well, now they'll remember." Michael shook his head. "I don't know, Sarah. I'm not sure I want the attention." "It's not about attention," Sarah said firmly. "It's about showing people that even in the hardest moments, there's still something worth holding on to. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there who's struggling will hear your story and find a little bit of hope." Reluctantly, Michael agreed. With Sarah's help, he reached out to a local news station, sharing his experience with Trump's call. The story spread quickly, first through local networks, then national ones. Within days, the moment had gone viral, with headlines like "Trump's emotional call to dying veterans" sparks nationwide conversation plastered across social media and news outlets. The response was overwhelming. Letters, emails, and messages poured in from people all over the country. Veterans who felt seen for the first time, parents who had lost children, even strangers who simply wanted to thank Michael for his service. For the first time in years, Michael didn't feel invisible. He felt part of something bigger than himself. One video stood out among the flood of responses. It was a simple clip of a young man, no older than 25, sitting in his car. His face was streaked with tears, his voice shaky as he spoke into the camera. "I saw the story about Mr. Reed," the man said, "and I wanted to say thank you. I've been struggling a lot lately thinking about giving up, but hearing what he's been through, how he keeps going, it's given me a reason to keep going too." Michael watched the video in silence, tears streaming down his face. He couldn't speak, couldn't even move. He just sat there, feeling the weight of what his story had done, how it had reached across miles, across screens, to touch the heart of someone he'd never met. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "See, Joe, you're making a difference, just like he said you would." Michael nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I never thought anything I did could matter this much." But as the messages kept coming, Michael began to realize that his story had become a beacon of hope, not just for others, but for himself as well. And the best part? It wasn't over yet. Weeks turned into months, and the story of Michael Reed continued to resonate. What had started as a private moment between a veteran and a former president had become a movement. Veterans groups reached out, inviting Michael to speak at events, virtually, given his declining health. Schools wanted to include his story in lessons about sacrifice and resilience, and families, strangers from all corners of the country, wrote to him about how his words had changed their perspective. Michael didn't have the strength to respond to every message, but Sarah made sure each one was read aloud to him. Each story of a life touched by his own became fuel for his soul, pushing him through the pain and exhaustion that came with his illness. One day, as Michael sat in his chair, gazing out the window at the Kansas plains, his phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Donald Trump, but a young woman named Sarah, a producer for a major news outlet. She wanted to run a special segment on Michael's life and his impact, titled "The Legacy of a Soldier's Story." "I'm no hero," Michael told her. "I'm just a man who did his duty." "That's exactly why your story matters," Sarah replied, "because it shows that ordinary people can do extraordinary things." The interview aired a week later, and it was as raw and honest as Michael had been throughout his life. He spoke about his time in Vietnam, the pain of losing his son, and the unexpected call that reignited a sense of purpose he thought was lost forever. By the end of the segment, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, not in Michael's living room, nor in the homes of the millions who tuned in to watch. As his health worsened, Michael made one final request to Sarah. When the time comes, he said, I want you to keep sharing the story. Not for me, but for everyone out there who thinks they've got nothing left to give. Sarah promised she would, her voice thick with emotion. Your story isn't just yours anymore, Joe. It's theirs now. When Michael passed away a few weeks later, his funeral was a testament to the lives he touched. Veterans from across the country came to pay their respects, some in uniform, others in everyday clothes, but all with the same gratitude in their eyes. Sarah stood strong as she greeted each one, knowing that Michael's legacy was far from over. In the days that followed, the video of Michael's phone call with Trump was shared once again, reigniting the conversation about the sacrifices veterans make and the importance of recognizing their stories. The young man who'd recorded the emotional video in his car posted a new one, standing next to a framed photo of Michael. I never met him, the man said, but Michael Reed saved my life, and I'll spend the rest of my days trying to live up to the example he set. Sarah smiled as she watched the video, her heart heavy but full of pride. She knew Michael would have been humbled by the outpouring of love and gratitude, and though he was gone, his story continued to inspire, proving that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found. Michael's journey was never just about a single phone call or a fleeting moment of recognition. It was about something far deeper, proof that every life, no matter how ordinary it may seem, carries a purpose. His story is a testament to the quiet strength that resides in all of us, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is still light to be found. Michael's courage to share his struggles, his losses, and his unwavering resilience touched countless lives in ways he never could have imagined. As we reflect on Michael's story, let's take a moment to recognize the heroes in our own lives. The veterans who have sacrificed so much, the parents who have endured loss, and the everyday people who carry silent burdens with unwavering strength. Their stories, like Michael's, deserve to be heard, honored, and remembered. Sometimes all it takes is a simple conversation, a heartfelt thank you, or just listening with an open heart to make someone feel seen and valued. But Michael's story isn't just about veterans. It's about all of us. It's about finding meaning in our struggles, about holding on when life feels too heavy, and about realizing that our experiences, both good and bad, can inspire and uplift others. If you've ever felt like your voice doesn't matter, like your story isn't worth sharing, let Michael's journey remind you otherwise. Every act of resilience, no matter how small, can create ripples that reach far beyond what we can see. We invite you to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Have you or someone you know ever faced a moment where hope felt distant? What helped you push through? Your words might just be the encouragement someone else needs today. Let's create a space where stories of courage and perseverance can live on and continue inspiring others. And if Michael's story has touched you in any way, consider honoring his legacy by spreading the message. Share this video with your friends and family because you never know who might need to hear it. Most importantly, don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and inspiring stories. Together, let's celebrate the power of compassion, courage, and hope, one story at a time. Michael may no longer be with us, but his story lives on in all of us. And as we carry his legacy forward, let's remember that every life, every voice, and every act of kindness has the power to make a difference.